If you struggle with hypersexuality, then you know how difficult it is to talk about. First, there's the shame, but then there's your bestie who says things like, yeah, you sound like my husband, completely not understanding what you're talking about or what hypersexuality is like. Hypersexuality looks different for everyone. For some, it's an insatiable sex drive. For others, it's a pornography addiction, compulsive masturbation, or cheating on your partner. And if you have bipolar disorder, ADHD, borderline personality disorder, or trauma, you're more likely to deal with it. If you don't have a safe place to talk about this, I'm here to help you understand what's going on and hopefully help you regain control over your runaway sex brain without completely losing your sex life. I'm Patty, the girl with blue energy. I have bipolar disorder and I make videos about mental health and personal growth. Let's start by talking about what hypersexuality actually is. The term hypersexual has been around since 1874. It replaced older terms that you probably heard of like nymphomania or satyriasis. But it still doesn't have a clear, agreed upon definition in the United States, which makes it really hard to discuss and be clear on. In 2010, they proposed a definition to put into the DSM-5, but it was rejected. So currently, we use a definition from international standards, so the ICD-10, to define hypersexuality, and that definition is termed compulsive sexual behavior disorder. Because it's a little confusing, I'm not going to go into the definition from the ICD-10, but you can look that up if you want. It kind of goes along with hypersexuality, but in the US, it seems that we use hypersexuality as more of a symptom that goes along with disorders than an actual disorder of its own, at least at this point. So I'm going to discuss what hypersexuality is as far as we understand it and how it affects different disorders like bipolar disorder, ADHD, borderline personality, and people who have trauma. So what do we consider hypersexuality? If you look up hypersexuality on the internet, you might find articles that say hypersexuality is a sex addiction. Well, that's not really true. It can show up as a sex addiction, but hypersexuality doesn't necessarily mean you're having a lot of sex. It means that you have an obsession with sex, sexual thoughts, sexual fantasies, or sexual activities. It can show up in different ways, such as constant sexual thoughts, compulsive masturbation, pornography addiction, sexual fantasies, risky sexual behaviors, cheating on your partners. Those are just some of the ways that hypersexuality can present itself. And how it presents itself has a lot to do with your mental health condition and your own sexuality. Something people don't realize about hypersexuality is that you can be hypersexual without even feeling turned on. Our reasons for becoming hypersexual aren't always about sexual arousal or sex drive. Sometimes there's emotional things going on, stress, boredom, procrastination. There are a lot of things that drive us to become hypersexual that aren't necessarily sexual arousal. And we may not even be satisfied by the sexual behavior we're doing. In fact, a lot of times we're not, but we'll still keep doing it out of some sort of compulsion, even if there's negative consequences. And that's kind of what differentiates hypersexuality from just having a high sex drive, is that you're driven or compelled to do these things, and you may not be able to control them, or you may keep doing them even though you're having negative consequences from them. So that's the big picture, but let's dive deeper, because hypersexuality looks very different in people who have bipolar disorder than it does in ADHD, BPD, or trauma. I'm going to start by talking about hypersexuality and bipolar disorder. Hypersexuality is a major symptom of bipolar disorder, and you normally see it during hypomanic or manic episodes. In fact, you can notice it right before for a hypomanic or manic episode, and it can also be a trigger for one. So if you notice yourself feeling more sexually aroused, sexually charged, or having whatever symptoms you typically have when you're feeling hypersexual, that can be an indicator that you're about to have a manic episode. I did a lot of research for this video, and there are some studies that suggest that women have more issues with hypersexuality and bipolar disorder, and then some other studies that say that's outdated and men have more of a problem. So I can't tell you whether men or women have more of a problem with this, but I did read some interesting information when I was researching this. And one was that men tended to have more sexual partners, have riskier sex, sex without condoms, sex with strangers, and women tended to have more issues with masturbation, which I found that a little interesting. I've known people with bipolar disorder, men and women, and I think that they can have all kinds of sexual behaviors when they're hypersexual. One key difference between hypersexuality in bipolar disorder and hypersexuality in other conditions is that we are mainly affected when we're manic or hypomanic. When we're manic, our hypersexuality isn't like other people's. It is compulsive, it is insatiable, it is almost maddening. It will wake you up in the middle of the night. It is not like a normal, just high sex drive or even compulsive behavior. It is intense and hard to control, hard to manage. It's not like what people think, and if you've never experienced it, you probably will not know what it feels like. I've heard people use this analogy before, but I'm going to use it here. It's almost like an itch that you need to scratch, but it's intense. You could be scratching your whole arm off, and you'd still need to itch. It's more like that. It's more like you took a pill that made you go completely bonkers, and you can't control your sex drive and feeling aroused and not being able to feel satisfied. It's kind of like that. I don't know that I'm doing it justice with the description, but I'm doing my best. Another thing people don't realize, and I'd love to hear if anyone else is like this, because I did a lot of research for this video, because my hypersexuality does not show up like the typical bipolar disorder description. I have issues with hypersexuality all the time, whether I'm manic or not. Hypersexuality can show up outside of manic episodes. It is called compulsive sexual behavior, and it can be comorbid with bipolar disorder. And if you're like me and have bipolar disorder and ADHD, well, then you might be hypersexual all the time. But if you notice that you feel hypersexual at more times than just when you're manic, it could be that you have a comorbid issue of compulsive sexual behavior, or perhaps you have a second diagnosis. I've even found some research where it shows up during depression. Now, it's not hypersexuality during depression episodes. What it is a way to self-soothe. And so people may use compulsive sexual behaviors to self-soothe, to comfort themselves, to regulate their emotions when they're depressed. Now let's talk about hypersexuality and ADHD, because hypersexuality and ADHD is extremely common. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of information on ADHD and hypersexuality, but I did do a lot of research, so hopefully I can help you figure out what's going on in your ADHD brain and why you might have problems with hypersexuality. Let's talk about your ADHD brain. So when you have ADHD, you have disruptions in your dopamine pathways. And this may be part of why you seek out stimulation or a dopamine release from sexual behaviors. But also you can have hyperfocus, which we all know people that have ADHD hyperfocus. And so you can get fixated on a person, a sexual fantasy, or a sexual behavior. Some interesting facts about ADHD and hypersexuality. Hypersexuality affects both genders equally with ADHD. And they also found that people with ADHD tend to have more sexual partners, and more of them identify as bisexual than the general population. What's interesting about hypersexuality and ADHD is it's not like bipolar disorder. It's not like it happens when there's a mood change. This is something that's more of a coping skill or how their brain works to deal with things. So it may happen during stress, overstimulation, boredom, emotional dysregulation, or procrastination. Like when they don't want to deal with things, they become hypersexual as a way to cope with things. And as someone who has both ADHD and bipolar, I can tell you that's a driving force for some of my hypersexuality, so it made sense when I started reading on it. Important things to know. Hypersexuality is not a symptom of ADHD. It's more of a malfunctioning coping mechanism. So people with ADHD tend to become hypersexual when they're under stress, when they're having problems regulating their emotions, when they're overstimulated. They generally have some reason why they become hypersexual versus just like bipolar mania, where we become hypersexual because we're manic. Another thing to consider is people sometimes become hypersexual because of substance abuse, and people that have ADHD often self-medicate, so that substance abuse can make them hypersexual, and it can also make them hyposexual, so they don't have much of a sex drive. It can go either way, but in any case, hypersexuality is very common in ADHD, but for very different reasons than bipolar disorder. Hypersexuality and borderline personality disorder is very common, but for different reasons than you see in ADHD or bipolar disorder. Let me start by telling you about the symptoms of borderline personality disorder. So people with BPD usually have extreme mood swings. They have problems with emotional dysregulation. They have issues with impulsivity, fear of abandonment, and most people that I've known with borderline personality disorder have issues with self-harm. All of these traits are part of what contributes to their impulsive or hypersexual behavior. People with BPD aren't hypersexual all the time. They tend to use hypersexuality as a coping mechanism. So they may become hypersexual when they're under stress, or when they're having problems regulating their emotions, or if they're trying to self-soothe. However, people with BPD have different issues than those of us with with bipolar disorder and ADHD. People with BPD generally have experienced some type of childhood trauma, and many of them have experienced some type of sexual abuse, which contributes to the hypersexuality and may also affect how their hypersexuality shows up. Because of the history with trauma, some people have issues with hypersexuality and some people avoid sex altogether. Research on hypersexuality and BPD shows that people with BPD tend to be more preoccupied with sex, may have more sexual partners, may be more impulsive or take more risks when it comes to sex, and they may be more likely to experience unwanted or harmful sex. And I've watched some other videos on BPD and hypersexuality that kind of said the same thing. I don't have BPD, but I do have some people in my life with it. And because of their issues with self-esteem and with relationships, they do sometimes get involved with partners that may be abusive or borderline abusive when it comes to sex. So that is something that you may see if you have borderline personality disorder. I'm going to briefly talk about trauma. Trauma can take many different forms. Many of us with mental health conditions have also experienced trauma, but trauma all on its own can contribute to hypersexuality. I don't want to dive into that too much in this video because it's a really complex topic and more than I can discuss in the length of this video. But I will say most people that experience hypersexuality due to trauma do not experience it during mood episodes, and it's not constant. It's typically seen as a coping mechanism of sorts, either as a way to self-soothe or to control emotion dysregulation. What should you do if you're experiencing hypersexuality? Hypersexuality is one of the hardest things I've ever had to talk about. It took me a really long time to find a therapist that I felt comfortable talking to about this. So, if you're experiencing hypersexuality, the best thing you can do is to find a therapist and talk to them about it. If you don't have a therapist, get one. It may take you some time to find someone that you feel comfortable with and someone that you can talk to about this, but trust me, they are trained to talk about these topics. So find a therapist, someone you're comfortable with, and talk to them about what you can do to cope with it, what you're experiencing, and how you're feeling about it, and especially the strategies you can use to deal with having hypersexuality. I'm going to tell you a few things that I do as someone with bipolar disorder to manage and deal with my hypersexuality without killing my sex life. The first thing is get your mood stable. If you're having problems with manic episodes, you're going to have problems in your relationship, regardless of the hypersexuality, but the hypersexuality is going to be really hard to manage if your moods aren't stable. So whether you have bipolar disorder or another disorder, get your mood stable. Also, if you're in a relationship, talk to your partner. Let them know you struggle with or you're struggling with hypersexuality and what that looks like for you. It's hard to have these conversations, but if they know what you're dealing with, you guys can manage it together and communicate about it together. My partner knows. I told him early on in the relationship that I had issues with hypersexuality so that he would know what to expect. For those of us who use compulsive sexual behaviors to deal with our emotions or manage stress, it is helpful to have other tools because you can't just use compulsive sexual behaviors to deal with all your emotional dysregulation or stress. So things like exercise or journaling or talking to a therapist, all of these things can help to de-stress and help you to manage your emotions so you're not relying on compulsive sexual behaviors. When I started working on this video, I was going to make it on hypersexuality and bipolar disorder because I have bipolar disorder, so I know a lot about it. But as I started researching this, I realized I have hypersexuality outside of hypomania and mania, and this isn't typical of the hypersexuality you see in bipolar disorder. And when I started researching hypersexuality and ADHD and trauma, I realized that a lot of the reasons why I have issues with hypersexuality aren't just because of mania or bipolar disorder. They are because of other issues like trying to regulate my emotions and stress. So that's why I decided to cover all the aspects of hypersexuality. This is a little longer of a video than I usually make, but I do think it was more informative than what you see in other content on hypersexuality, and I hope that it was helpful for you. If you support my channel and what I'm trying to do, I would really appreciate it if you would click the like button and, of course, subscribe. I'll have another video for you guys real soon.